I hid my brother's passport to teach him a lesson. You won't believe how it backfired and then... I'm David Brooks, 30 years old, and have spent the better part of my life trying to be the responsible older sibling to my younger brother, Jason. Jason is 26, still lives at home with our parents in Providence, Rhode Island, and somehow manages to turn every moment into a test of my patience. I've always thought that by his age, he'd develop a sense of responsibility, but it seems like the concept eludes him. Growing up, I was the kind of kid who followed the rules. I saved up for what I wanted, respected people's boundaries, and avoided causing unnecessary trouble. Jason, on the other hand, is a walking storm. He has this knack for taking what's not his, breaking it, and then acting like I'm the unreasonable one when I call him out. Our parents, Karen and John, don't help. They excuse his behavior, insisting it's all part of being brothers. You were just as reckless at his age, Mom likes to say, as if I ever caused the kind of chaos Jason thrives on. When we were kids, I brushed off most of Jason's antics as typical sibling nonsense. Pens would disappear from my desk, only to turn up in his room covered in doodles. My favorite jacket came back one winter with a mysterious stain that he swore wasn't his fault. These were minor annoyances, things I could laugh about back then. But as we got older, the stakes changed. The turning point started a few years ago when Jason began borrowing things without asking. At first, it was small stuff, a pair of sunglasses or a book. Then, it escalated. Last year, he borrowed my high-end headphones, the ones I'd saved up for months to buy. When I finally got them back, one side was snapped clean off. I confronted him, expecting an apology or at least some kind of remorse. Instead, he shrugged and said, "I'll fix it," like that was supposed to make everything okay. Spoiler alert, he didn't fix it. I should have known then that things wouldn't change. A few weeks later, it was my brand new shirt. I hadn't even worn it yet. Jason borrowed it for some party and returned it with a rip down the sleeve. Not long after that, I caught him wearing my smartwatch during a FaceTime call with his friends. I hadn't even realized he'd taken it. When I confronted him, he brushed it off with his usual nonchalance, promising to give it back. It took weeks to get it from him, and by then, the screen was scratched. Every time something like this happened, I felt like I was bleeding money just trying to replace the things he ruined. I tried setting boundaries. I told him, very clearly, that he needed to ask before taking anything that belonged to me. He nodded, pretending to listen, but the very next day, he walked into my room and grabbed my phone charger off my desk as if the conversation never happened. At one point, I got so frustrated that I installed locks on my bedroom door. For a brief moment, I thought I'd finally outsmarted him. But Jason always finds a way. A couple of weeks later, I came home from work to find my limited edition gaming console missing. It wasn't just any console. It was a collector's item I'd saved for years to buy. When I tracked him down, he admitted that he'd lent it to a friend. A friend. It didn't come back for 2 weeks, and when it did, it was covered in scratches. The final straw came when Jason took the one thing I thought he'd never touch. It was a vintage pocket watch, a gift from our grandfather who had passed away a few years ago. It wasn't flashy or trendy. It had sentimental value. I don't even know why Jason wanted it. By the time I got it back, the strap was torn, and the face was scratched beyond repair. I held that watch in my hands and felt something snap inside me. This wasn't just about broken things anymore. It was about respect, or rather, the complete lack of it. I tried talking to my parents about Jason's behavior, hoping they'd finally step in. Mom waved me off with her usual excuses. "He's your brother, David. It's what siblings do." Dad, as predictable as ever, chimed in with, "You're the older one. Set a better example." As if me saving up for my belongings and expecting them to stay intact was setting a bad example. The truth is, they never held Jason accountable for anything, and he knew it. Why should he stop when there were no consequences? It all came to a head one evening when I found Jason rummaging through my desk again. I lost it, yelling at him about the watch, the console, the smartwatch, and everything else he'd ruined over the years. Jason rolled his eyes and walked out of the room, muttering something about how I needed to relax. My parents, of course, sided with him. "He's just being Jason," Mom said, handing me a cup of coffee as if that would magically solve everything. That night, As I sat in my room staring at the lock on my door, I realized something important. Jason wasn't going to change, not unless someone made him. For years, I'd let things slide, hoping he'd grow out of it. But if no one else was going to hold him accountable, maybe it was time I did. As much as I hated the idea of sinking to his level, I knew I couldn't keep letting him walk all over me. The question was, how far was I willing to go to teach him a lesson? After the watch incident, I felt like I'd hit my breaking point with Jason. Every time I thought he couldn't possibly be more careless or disrespectful, he found a way to prove me wrong. I'd tried everything, talking, yelling, setting boundaries, but nothing worked. He either brushed me off or acted like I was the problem. The locks on my bedroom door were supposed to be my solution. For a few days, they gave me a fleeting sense of victory. I could finally leave the house without worrying about what might disappear or return broken. But Jason didn't see those locks as a barrier. He saw them as a challenge. One evening, I came home to find my gaming console, the limited edition one I'd saved for nearly 2 years to buy, gone. I didn't even need to ask where it was. Jason was lounging on the couch, scrolling through his phone like he didn't have a care in the world. "Where's my console?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Jason looked up at me, completely unfazed. "Oh, I lent it to Aaron. He needed it for the weekend." Aaron was one of Jason's friends, a guy I'd met a few times and didn't particularly like. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Jason had no right to touch my stuff, let alone give it to someone else. "You lent it to Aaron?" I said, my voice rising. "Are you out of your mind?" "That's mine, Jason. You didn't even ask." He shrugged. "Relax, David. He'll bring it back." I wanted to scream. Instead, I turned and walked into my room, slamming the door behind me. I couldn't trust my own brother, and our parents were no help. Every time I brought up Jason's behavior, they dismissed it. Mom would wave me off with a sigh, and Dad's standard response was, "You're the older one. Be patient." Patient. That word made my blood boil. I'd been patient my whole life, and where had it gotten me? With a broken watch, a scratched-up smartwatch, ripped shirts, and now a missing gaming console. The console didn't come back for 2 weeks. When it did, it was scratched and covered in fingerprints. Aaron had clearly not taken care of it, and Jason didn't even apologize. He handed it to me like he was doing me a favor. "See? No harm done," he said, grinning. I didn't even respond. I took the console and went straight to my room, locking the door behind me. That night, as I stared at the ceiling, I realized I couldn't keep living like this. Jason wasn't going to stop, and my parents weren't going to hold him accountable. If anything was going to change, I'd have to take matters into my own hands. Things hit an all-time low a few weeks later. Jason borrowed my jacket, a nice leather one I'd bought for a job interview, and returned it with a tear down the sleeve. He claimed he didn't know how it happened, but I wasn't buying it. I could see the guilt in his eyes, but instead of owning up to it, he doubled down. "Why do you even care so much?" he said, his tone defensive. "It's just a jacket." "It's not just a jacket, Jason," I shot back. "It's about respect. You keep taking my stuff without asking, and you never take care of it. Do you have any idea how frustrating that is?" He rolled his eyes. "You're overreacting." I wanted to punch a hole in the wall. Instead, I stormed out of the house, needing some air before I said something I'd regret. That weekend, our family was preparing for a big international trip. We were flying to Cancun for a much-needed vacation, something Jason had been talking about nonstop. He was already planning his Instagram posts, picking out outfits, and bragging to his friends about the resort we were staying at. One evening, as I was grabbing a snack from the kitchen, I noticed Jason's passport lying on the dining table. It was just sitting there, unattended, like everything else he owned. For a moment, I just stared at it. And then an idea hit me. A dangerous, reckless idea. I thought about all the times Jason had taken something that mattered to me. The watch, the console, the countless other things he'd borrowed, broken, or lost. What if, just this once, he got a taste of his own medicine? The thought made my heart race. I knew it was extreme, even for me, but the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. Jason needed to understand what it felt like to lose something important because of someone else's carelessness. I picked up the passport and slipped it into my pocket. My hands were shaking as I walked to my room and closed the door behind me. I didn't even know where I'd hide it at first, but eventually, I settled on an old shoebox buried in the back of my closet. For a moment, I felt a pang of guilt. This wasn't like me. I'd never done anything like this before. But then I remembered the broken headphones, the scratched smartwatch, and the torn leather jacket. I thought about how Jason had never once apologized or tried to make things right. If no one else was going to teach him a lesson, maybe it was up to me. The next day, the chaos began. Jason realized his passport was missing and went into full panic mode. He tore apart his room, the living room, and even the laundry room, yelling the whole time. Mom and Dad joined the search, growing more frantic by the minute. Jason accused me outright, but I just shrugged and pretended to scroll through my phone. Why would I even want your passport? I said, keeping my tone as casual as possible. Jason didn't believe me, of course. He narrowed his eyes and muttered something about how I was always complaining about him. Mom shot me a suspicious look, and I could feel Dad's frustration simmering beneath the surface. By the end of the day, the house was a war zone. Every drawer, shelf, and closet had been ransacked. Jason was pacing the living room, running his hands through his hair, while Mom muttered under her breath about how irresponsible he was. Dad kept glancing at the clock, probably calculating how much time we had left before the trip. Through it all, I sat on the couch, silent. Part of me felt vindicated, watching Jason experience even a fraction of the frustration he'd caused me over the years. But another part of me couldn't shake the guilt. Had I gone too far? That night, as I lay in bed, I stared at the shoebox in my closet, my mind racing. The trip was in less than 48 hours. If I didn't return the passport soon, Jason wouldn't be going anywhere. For the first time, I wondered if I was crossing a line I couldn't uncross. The morning after Jason discovered his passport was missing, the house felt like a pressure cooker. He was stomping through every room, muttering under his breath and tossing pillows, cushions, and even cereal boxes in a frantic search. Every now and then, he'd pause to glare at me, like he was trying to figure out if I was the culprit. "David, you took it, didn't you?" Jason finally snapped, standing in the doorway of the living room where I was pretending to read something on my phone. "Why would I want your passport?" I replied without looking up. "Maybe if you weren't so careless with your stuff, this wouldn't have happened." That, of course, didn't go over well. Jason stormed off, shouting accusations over his shoulder. Mom and Dad tried to calm him down, but their patience was wearing thin too. Dad had started pacing the kitchen, muttering about how much it would cost to delay the trip. Mom, on the other hand, looked like she was one misplaced sock away from losing her mind. "Jason, you need to think," she said for the 5th time that morning. "Where did you last see it?" "I already told you," Jason yelled. "I left it on the table. Someone must have moved it." Mom turned to me, her expression sharp. "David, if you know anything about this, now is the time to say so." I shrugged. "I don't know anything. Maybe he left it at Aaron's place. He's always dragging his stuff everywhere." Jason stormed back into the room, pointing a finger at me like a lawyer delivering closing arguments. "You've been mad at me for weeks. You probably took it just to mess with me." "Jason, that's ridiculous," Dad cut in, but I could tell from his tone that he wasn't entirely convinced. "Let's not start throwing around accusations. Let's search David's room," Jason demanded, crossing his arms. "If he didn't take it, he has nothing to hide." "Seriously?" I said, standing up. "You've trashed every other room in the house, and now you want to invade my privacy too?" "It's just to rule things out," Mom said, trying to sound reasonable but failing. "We need to find that passport." I wanted to fight it, but I knew that would only make me look guilty. Reluctantly, I agreed, watching as Jason and my parents tore through my room. They opened drawers, sifted through papers, and even checked under my mattress. The whole time, I stood by the door, my arms crossed, trying not to let the smug look on Jason's face get to me. Of course, they didn't find anything. The passport was safely tucked away in the shoebox at the back of my closet. When their search came up empty, Jason's frustration boiled over. "He probably hid it somewhere else," he shouted, throwing his hands in the air. "This isn't a coincidence." Jason, that's enough, Dad said, his voice firm. You're the one who lost it. Maybe if you weren't so careless, we wouldn't be in this situation. Jason's face turned red. He stormed off to his room, slamming the door behind him. The rest of the house felt heavy with silence. Mom sat down at the dining table, rubbing her temples, while Dad leaned against the counter, staring at the floor. I stayed quiet, unsure if I'd taken things too far, or if this was the wake-up call Jason needed. By the end of the day, the atmosphere in the house was unbearable. Jason alternated between rage and despair, accusing me one minute and blaming himself the next. Mom and Dad tried to come up with solutions, like delaying the trip or applying for an emergency passport, but nothing seemed to calm Jason down. Later that evening, I overheard him on the phone with Erin. I swear, man, David's trying to ruin my life, he said, his voice low but still audible through the thin walls. He's been on my case about everything lately. He probably took it just to get back at me. I rolled my eyes and turned up the volume on my headphones, but I couldn't block out the sound of his frustration. It was strange. I'd always wanted Jason to face the consequences of his actions, but now that it was happening, I wasn't sure how to feel. Part of me felt vindicated. Another part felt uneasy, like I was crossing a line I couldn't uncross. The next morning, things escalated. Jason had barely slept, and it showed. He looked disheveled, his hair a mess and his eyes bloodshot. When he came into the kitchen, he barely said a word to anyone. He just poured himself a cup of coffee and sat at the table, staring blankly ahead. Jason, Dad said, sitting down across from him, we need to make a decision about the trip. If we don't leave tomorrow, we're going to lose the flights. Jason didn't respond. He just rubbed his temples and muttered something under his breath. Mom, ever the peacemaker, tried to suggest another search of the house, but Jason wasn't having it. What's the point? He said, his voice flat. It's gone. You can still get an emergency passport, Dad said, trying to sound optimistic. It's not ideal, but it's better than missing the whole trip. Jason slammed his hand on the table, startling everyone. Why does it even matter? David's probably sitting on it, laughing at me. He's been waiting for this moment. Jason, that's enough. Mom snapped, surprising all of us. She rarely raised her voice, but even she had reached her limit. We're not going to solve anything by throwing accusations around. Jason stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. I'm done with this. All of you. He stormed out of the house, grabbing his jacket on the way. Mom called after him, but he didn't stop. The door slammed shut, and we were left in stunned silence. For a moment, none of us said anything. Then Mom sat down, burying her face in her hands. This has gone too far, she said softly. I didn't respond. I just went back to my room and locked the door. The passport was still in its hiding spot, untouched. I stared at the shoebox, my mind racing. Had I gone too far? Or was this exactly what Jason needed to learn how much his carelessness hurt the people around him? As the hours ticked by, I realized I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that the fallout was far from over. The day after Jason stormed out was eerily quiet. The house, which had been buzzing with arguments and frantic searches, now felt hollow. Mom wandered from room to room, occasionally picking up discarded cushions or papers from Jason's failed search. Dad sat at the kitchen table with his laptop, calculating the cost of postponing the trip, his expression a mix of frustration and exhaustion. I tried to go about my day as usual, but the tension was impossible to ignore. Every so often, Mom would glance at me, her eyes heavy with suspicion. She didn't say anything outright, but I could feel the weight of her thoughts. Dad wasn't any better. His silence was louder than words. They both thought I was involved, and the unspoken accusations were starting to wear on me. That afternoon, Jason called. I could hear his voice through Mom's phone, loud and angry. He was staying at Erin's place and wasn't planning on coming back anytime soon. He blamed me for everything, of course, and Mom didn't exactly defend me. When she hung up, she sighed and looked at me. David, if you know anything about his passport, just tell us, she said quietly. This has gone too far. I already told you, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I don't know where it is. Maybe he lost it at Erin's. She didn't respond, just gave me a tired look and walked away. The silence that followed was suffocating. I knew I could end this whole ordeal by returning the passport, but every time I thought about it, I remembered the scratched console, the broken watch, the ripped shirt. This wasn't just about the passport anymore. It was about making Jason understand what it felt like to deal with the consequences of his actions. By evening, the situation had escalated even further. Jason had taken to social media, posting vague messages about toxic family dynamics and how people closest to you could hurt you the most. His friends flooded the comments with support, some of them even calling me out directly. My phone buzzed nonstop with messages from mutual acquaintances, asking why I'd sabotage my brother's trip. I ignored them all. Meanwhile, the family drama was spilling over into our extended relatives. Jason had apparently called a few of them, spinning a story that painted him as the victim of my supposed vendetta. Aunts, uncles, and cousins started calling mom and dad, offering advice or, in some cases, thinly veiled criticism about how they'd handled the situation. "This is your fault," one aunt had told mom, loud enough for me to hear from the other room. "You've always let Jason get away with too much." For once, I couldn't disagree. It was oddly satisfying to hear someone else acknowledge what I'd been dealing with for years. But it also added to the chaos. Mom was in tears by the end of the call, and Dad was muttering angrily about everyone meddling in our business. The following morning, things hit their breaking point. Dad managed to find a last-minute appointment for Jason to apply for an emergency passport. The plan was to reschedule the flights and salvage the trip, but the cost of rebooking was astronomical. Dad spent the entire morning on the phone with airlines and travel agents, his frustration mounting with every call. When Jason finally came home that afternoon to pick up some of his things, the tension boiled over. He barged into the house, ignoring Mom's attempt at a warm greeting, and went straight to the living room where I was sitting. "You're unbelievable, David," he said, his voice dripping with anger. "You couldn't just let it go, could you?" "Let what go?" I asked, keeping my tone even. "You lost your passport." "That's not my fault," he scoffed, shaking his head. "Everyone knows you're behind this. Just admit it." "I don't know what you want me to say," I replied. "Maybe if you stopped treating everything like it's yours to take, you wouldn't be in this mess." That was all it took to set him off. Jason launched into a tirade, listing every argument we'd ever had, every complaint I'd ever made about him. He accused me of being bitter, jealous, and spiteful. Mom and Dad tried to intervene, but their attempts to calm him down only made things worse. "I'm done with this family," Jason shouted, grabbing a duffel bag from his room. "You all act like I'm the problem, but it's him," he said, pointing at me. "He's the one who's been trying to screw me over since day one." "Jason, that's enough," Dad said, his voice stern. "This isn't helping anyone." Jason didn't listen. He stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him. The silence that followed was deafening. Mom sat down on the couch, her head in her hands, while Dad paced the room, muttering to himself. "This has gone too far," Mom said quietly. "I don't even know how we got here." I didn't respond. I just stood up and went to my room, locking the door behind me. The passport was still in its hiding spot, untouched. I stared at the shoebox, my mind racing. Jason's outburst had left me shaken, but I wasn't sure if it was enough to make me change course. Part of me wanted to return the passport and end the chaos. Another part felt like he needed to face this, even if it hurt. That night, I overheard Mom and Dad talking in hushed tones in the kitchen. They were debating whether to cancel the trip altogether or just go without Jason. Mom was leaning towards staying behind to help Jason sort things out, but Dad argued that we couldn't keep catering to his mistakes. As much as I hated to admit it, Dad had a point. Jason had always been bailed out of every problem he created, and it hadn't done him any favors. Maybe this was the only way for him to learn. But as I lay in bed, staring at the clock, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was crossing a line I couldn't uncross. The fallout was spiraling out of control, and the worst part was, I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep pretending I had nothing to do with it. The morning after Jason stormed out, I woke up to an unexpected text from him. It simply said, "We need to talk. Just us." There was no explanation, no attempt to smooth things over, just a request. I stared at the message for a long time, debating whether to respond. Part of me wanted to ignore him and let him stew, but another part knew we couldn't keep this cycle going. I agreed to meet him at a park not far from the house. When I arrived, Jason was already sitting on a bench, fidgeting with his phone. He looked different, less angry, more anxious. For a moment, it felt like we were kids again, sitting in the backyard trying to fix something we'd broken before Mom or Dad found out. "I'm glad you came," Jason said as I sat down. His voice was quieter than usual, and there was no trace of the bravado he usually carried. "I almost didn't," I admitted. He nodded, running a hand through his hair. "Look, I messed up. I've been messing up for years, and I know that now. I've been a jerk to you, to Mom and Dad, to everyone. Really, I didn't say anything. I just let him keep talking. I got so used to everyone letting me off the hook that I didn't think about how it affected you," he continued. "Taking your stuff, breaking things. It wasn't just careless. It was selfish. And I'm sorry." Hearing those words was like a weight lifting off my chest, but I wasn't ready to let him off the hook just yet. "Do you really mean that, Jason? Or is this just because the trip is falling apart?" He shook his head. "I mean it. This isn't about the trip. This is about me realizing I've been a terrible brother." I studied his face, looking for any sign that he wasn't being sincere. But for the first time, I didn't see any deflection or excuses. He looked genuinely remorseful. "What do you want me to say?" I asked finally. "Nothing," he said. "I just want you to know that I'm going to make things right. I've already started working extra hours at the coffee shop to pay you back for everything I've damaged. The headphones, the watch, the console. It's all going to be replaced. And I'll stop taking your stuff. I swear." I wasn't sure if I believed him, but the fact that he was making an effort was a start. "This is your last chance, Jason. If you screw up again, I'm done. No more second chances." "I get it," he said, nodding. "And I won't screw up. I promise." We sat in silence for a while after that, the weight of everything we'd been through settling between us. Eventually, Jason stood up. "Thanks for hearing me out," he said. "Don't thank me yet," I replied. "Show me you're serious." That evening, Jason returned to the house with a folder in hand. Inside were receipts for everything he'd replaced or repaired: the headphones, the smartwatch, even the gaming console. He handed them to me without a word, and I could see the nervousness in his eyes. Mom and Dad were cautiously optimistic. Mom hugged Jason, saying how proud she was of him for taking responsibility. Dad, ever the pragmatist, reminded him that this wasn't a one-time fix. "Consistency, Jason," Dad said. "That's what matters." To my surprise, Jason nodded in agreement. "I know." With the replacements settled, we finally sat down as a family to talk about the trip. Mom and Dad had rebooked the flights, and Jason was determined to join us. For the first time in days, the tension in the house started to lift. The trip itself was surprisingly peaceful. Jason made a noticeable effort to respect boundaries. He asked before borrowing anything, even something as small as sunscreen. It was a small gesture, but it meant a lot. One night, while we were sitting by the pool, Jason turned to me. "Do you think we'll ever be okay?" he asked. I thought about it for a moment. "We'll get there," I said. "But it's going to take time." He nodded, seeming to accept that. When we got back home, Jason kept his word. He stayed out of my room, replaced every item he'd damaged, and even started looking for his own place. It was strange seeing him take responsibility for his life after so many years of chaos, but it was a welcome change. As for me, I realized I had my own changes to make. I'd been holding on to so much resentment, not just toward Jason, but toward our parents for letting things get this bad. It wasn't easy, but I started focusing on better communication. I made it clear when something bothered me instead of letting it build up. The house felt different after that trip. Not perfect, but better. We all started respecting each other's space, and for the first time in years, it felt like a home instead of a battlefield. As for the passport, I quietly returned it the day after we got back. I slipped it onto the dining table where Jason had left it weeks ago. He never asked about it, and I never explained. Some things are better left unsaid. Now, whenever I lock my bedroom door, it's out of habit, not fear. After everything, I think that's okay. If you face similar struggles, hit the like button, Share this story and comments. What would you have done? Subscribe for more stories that will keep you hooked.